In the summer of 1914, an assassin's bullet killed the Archduke and heir apparent to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand. It immediately launched most of Europe into the First World War. The United States, however, issued a routine declaration of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson had been elected to office on both a moderate progressive agenda as well as his anti-imperialism position. While we won't get into too much detail about the First World War's origin, as we've covered that in world history last year, this unit will look at President Wilson's handling of the outbreak of war and the pre-war years for the United States, as well as the events that pushed the United States into the First World War. If you're struggling to remember the details about the origin of World War I, please look back at a YouTube video such as Simplified History or Crash Course History that can go over those basic details of how militarism, nationalism, imperialism, as well as alliance making pushed Europe into the First World War. For our purposes, we'll be looking mostly at the American reaction to war abroad, efforts to try to remain neutral, as well as the tipping point that pushed the country into the war to end all wars. At the outbreak of war, Europe had been divided into two key alliances. The Central Powers, led by Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later Turkey and Bulgaria. And on the other side, the Triple Entente, or allies of France, Britain, and Russia. Later, Japan and Italy would also join this group. When war in Europe broke out, the United States was content to stay home. In fact, the money that Britain and France would spend on war orders to U.S. industries would actually pull the United States out of a recession. The chief financer of the Triple Entente was American investor J.P. Morgan, who lent the Allies $2.3 million to purchase weapons and supplies from American companies, while the government of the United States proposed neutrality. There was a business intelligence behind America's declaration of neutrality. Up until the outbreak of World War I, Britain had been America's single leading trade partner. However, the United States was also doing an equal amount of business with the rest of Europe. Up until 1916, the United States exported equally to both Britain and Europe's leading countries of France, Italy, and Germany. So Germans legally could have done the same amount of trading with the United States, but was prevented from doing so by a highly successful British Navy blockade. By 1916, trade between the United States and Germany had virtually ceased. Germany's response to the British blockade was the implementation of a new technology. The Unterseeboot, or the U-boat, a precursor to the modern submarine, was deployed as a way to both attack British naval ships as well as to sink merchant ships that would bring the British people economic and military relief. President Wilson decided on a calculated risk. He continued to claim that America would remain neutral in its trading practices, while hoping that the forced trade between the United States and Britain would not lead to an attack on American ships or some other kind of incident that would cause war. What we're seeing here is a map that demonstrates just how vast the territory British blockade of Europe's ports really was. In the yellow is the territory that was patrolled by the British Navy. Within the red was the active zone of German submarine resistance. And identified with the bomb blast is where the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland, May 7th, 1915. We'll talk more about the Lusitania here in a moment, but ships that were going towards British ports were subject to being attacked as they were considered to be carrying war material to Germany's enemy. Here's a picture of a German Unterseeboot, or U-boat. Unlike modern submarines, the U-boat had to surface in order to fire its missiles. This would create a vulnerability, as a naval cruiser could cut a U-boat in half by running over it. So the U-boat would have to surface, fire its missiles in relatively short order, and then submerge itself again to remain protected. The creation of the U-boat would also challenge contemporary naval law, which traditionally required that a boat seek the surrender of an enemy ship before destroying it. Because of the vulnerability of the Unterseeboot, Germany did not participate in that tradition and instead would fire without warning. In the first months of 1915, U-boats sank 90 ships inside the war zone. One of those boats was the passenger liner, the Lusitania, which was torpedoed off of the coast of Ireland, May 7, 1915. Nearly 1,200 people were killed, including 128 Americans. What many people don't realize about the sinking of the Lusitania is that the Lusitania was carrying a cargo load full of small arms, ammunitions, and supplies for the British government from the United States. While the ship itself was a passenger ship, it did have a secret military purpose. Germany would use this as an example of its justification for attacking cruise liners. However, the Yellow Press would call for war with mottos such as "Remember the Lusitania." This is a advertisement for travel on the luxury liner Lusitania. Beneath the travel schedule, you can see a notice to travelers that there is a state of war between Germany and Britain, and that there's potential risk for being attacked on any kind of boat within this war zone. Many high schoolers are surprised to find out the sinking of the Lusitania was not the moment that pivoted America into war. In fact, many Midwestern Americans who had family ties to Germany and Eastern Europe continued to be ardent supporters of Kaiser Wilhelm and the actions of the Central Powers up until this point. Wilson responded to the attack on the Lusitania and America's naval rights by issuing a series of strong notes to the Kaiser. America was divided into two camps at this point: those that sought peace and continued neutrality, as represented by the isolationist William Jennings Bryan, who was Secretary of State, even balked at these notes that Wilson sent as too much of a provocation and feared that war was on the horizon. On the other hand, were those imperialists and those that supported war against the Kaiser in defense of Americans' naval rights, people like Teddy Roosevelt, who harshly criticized Wilson as being too soft and meek when it came to America's response to German aggression. By March of 1916, Germany once again torpedoed a passenger liner. The French ship Sussex was destroyed. Wilson sent an ultimatum to the Germans that unless they stopped the practice of sinking merchant ships and passenger liners without warning, he would break diplomatic relations with Germany, which would be the first step in a declaration of war. What became known as the Sussex Ultimatum led to an agreement by the Germans to not sink passengers or merchant ships without warning. The Kaiser tried to attach to this the condition that the United States would seek the easement of trading restrictions against Germany, but Wilson really had no power to address that. Wilson knew that the duration of the Sussex Agreement was entirely in the hands of the Germans, who could disregard it at a moment's notice. This is a political cartoon that was promoted by imperialist Republicans. You can see here the baffled Wilson taking blood money from the Kaiser as he walks away from the sea where Americans had lost their lives. The election of 1916 hinged on one principal question: would there be war? While the Republican Party had reunified, as former President Teddy Roosevelt had agreed not to seek re-election against Wilson, the party stood for a stronger tariff, an assault on financial trusts, and a strong position against America's foreign enemies. Americans felt they had unfinished business with both Mexico and Germany. Wilson's sole campaign promise was that he would keep America out of the World War. Election day results between President Wilson and Republican Charles Evans Hughes were incredibly tight. Hughes swept the eastern coast. People there had been touched by a few high-profile acts of sabotage by German spies in American factories. Furthermore, the battle over the sea seemed to be happening in their own backyard. And lastly, there were fewer German immigrants along the Atlantic coast than there were in the Midwest. The support Wilson received from his fellow Southerners, as well as anti-war German immigrants within the Midwest, left the election to the state of California. With fewer than 4,000 votes out of about 1 million cast, the state of California tipped in favor of Wilson and gave him a second term. But while Wilson would win the election itself was far from a referendum on whether the United States should go to war or remain at peace. Wilson continued to promote a policy of neutrality and encouraged the belligerents in Europe to seek peace without victory. Neither side was interested. Germany changed its policy away from the Sussex Agreement, believing that regardless of the consequences of submarine warfare, America would be too slow to mobilize for war and give them the needed time to defeat their British counterpart. On January 31st, Germany announced that it would return to unrestricted submarine warfare. It really hoped to defeat the Allies before the United States would be good to enter the war. Wilson hoped that the change in policy would not lead to more American deaths on the high seas, and waited for an overt act of war by the Germans. That act came not as another submarine attack, but as an intercepted diplomatic cable from the German ambassador, Arthur Zimmermann, to the Mexican foreign minister, seeking an alliance and encouraging a Mexican invasion into the southeastern portion of the United States. Germany tempted the anti-Yankee Mexico with promises of helping them recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, territories that had been lost during the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. This, coupled with a series of German U-boat attacks on unarmed American merchant vessels, were the overt acts President Wilson feared 1917 would indeed be a year of turning points. As America entered the war, Russia stepped away. The Russian Revolution had toppled the Tsarist regime, and the Bolsheviks viewed the war against Germany and Austria as a capitalist land grab. As Russia withdrew from the Eastern Front and Germany sent its battle-tested boys to the West, Americans knew that without intervention, France and Britain would be next to fall. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson mounted the podium before Congress once again and asked for a declaration of war.